creation of national parks by national governments with the encouragement and support of international conservation movements have been working to preserve the biodiversity, ecological integrity, and the idea of wilderness for centuries. National parks are often modeled after these Western ideals. This can be problematic for indigenous populations that have inhabited these forested areas for centuries, as they can have their rights to resources limited, suffer cultural loss, and even be displaced entirely. One example of these injustices, and the focus of this video, is the experiences of the indigenous people of Manú National Park in Peru.
Historically, the creation of national parks has utilized the theories of fortress conservation. Busher and Dressler describe fortress conservation as the belief that human interaction with nature threatens its preservation, and therefore it seeks to exclude human inhabitants entirely. This management strategy is an invention of Western mainstream environmental groups. The conservation agenda is guided by perceptions of elite organizations influenced by Western scientists that define wilderness as separate from humans. Manú National Park is in the southeast region of Peru, deep in the Amazon. It is an area of rich biodiversity and a long history of human habitation.
The Matsigenka people are just one of the many native groups living within the park, and they are the most contacted. In order to continue living in the area, sustainable living rules have been set by the park's administration. Sustainable agriculture and traditional hunting practices must be used to reduce the impact of the population on the surrounding diversity. This is dictated by the park's management, which adheres to Western ideals of conservation, despite the fact that the indigenous people of Manu have been integrated into the ecosystem over thousands of years. This prioritization of biological diversity over cultural diversity leads to the further marginalization of indigenous people, who have little political voice.
The fortress conservation method is supported by theories and structures that explain the power dynamics of environmental management. Neocolonialism acts to allow Western entities to exert influence on the resource management of governments and communities in the global South. This is compounded by neoprotectionism, which touts the conservation of biodiversity as a moral imperative, as well as utilitarianism, which defends injustices against some for the benefit of the greater good in the form of preserved biodiversity. Finally, the World Society theory maintains that transnational intergovernmental agencies and non-governmental organizations should groom state actors in developing countries to carry out the type of conservation promoted by mainstream environmentalism. National parks and protected areas are often created as a result of these processes and theories.
Manú National Park was created by the Peruvian government as a response to pressures from within more developed countries. Geographically, much of the world's biodiversity is located in the tropics, often within post-colonial countries. In these countries, modernization is prioritized. Thus, entities of more developed countries who value biodiversity as a vital resource take interest in the modernization process, with a focus on conservation. Neoliberalism, in theory, offers a way for countries to simultaneously develop economically, promote conservation, and provide opportunities for local communities. This is meant to be done through the commodification of nature, especially through ecotourism, which creates economic incentive for a well-preserved ecosystem. National governments are encouraged to create protected areas by conservation NGOs, Western investors, and international institutions, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which champion the neoliberal management of resources. This is done in order to gain a competitive advantage in the ecotourism industry, with little concern for indigenous populations within them.
In Manú National Park, for example, the Amazon Conservation Association is one of the most influential organizations. It is committed to ecotourism and biodiversity rather than the preservation of indigenous populations. The Amazon is the most diverse forest on Earth. This has led to the establishment of Manú National Park and many others like it as a World Heritage Site. Its biodiversity attracts tourists from around the world.
In keeping with the ideas of both mainstream environmentalism and neoliberal conservation, the Amazon Conservation Association views indigenous people as a threat to the natural ecosystem, and therefore encourages them to adopt more sustainable livelihoods, which focus on their integration into the modern markets through ecotourism.
Even those who are not displaced, as is the case in Manú National Park, are restricted in their resource use. These restrictions can also erode local knowledge as contacted groups reach into outside markets to sustain themselves. One example of this is the Matsigenka's participation in the tourist industry, which is often encouraged by foreign investors. However, the tourist industry is particularly vulnerable to changes in the global economy and political events. Therefore, it fails to provide a sustainable income as supplementary to subsistence practices.
This is especially true because the abundance within Manú National Park also attracts competitors in the ecotourism industry. These competitors have formed a coalition called Ecotour Manu to work toward park regulations that favor their business. The Matsigenka, who have built a jungle lodge known as Casa Manu, are moving toward ecotourism as a source of income and business experience. However, members of the Matsigenka that choose to participate in the ecotourism industry are in direct competition with larger companies who actively seek to restrict their opportunities. For example, Ecotour Manu has filed lawsuits challenging the exemption of the Matsigenka from the operator fees that other ecotourism companies have to pay. Because of the discrepancy of size and power between these two groups, the Matsigenka have been forced to rent out Casa Manu to the larger ecotourism companies, resulting in a much smaller profit reaching the community. In addition, ecotourism threatens uncontacted tribes as its tour networks expand.
The influence of neocolonialism, neoliberalism, powerful international entities, and economic interests of ecotourism coalitions explain why fortress conservation is still dominant, despite critiques that it is ineffective. One such critique comes from Dahlberg, Rode, and Sandel, who argue that the persistence of an ideology that separates the human from the natural and wild is contradictory, especially when it results in the commodification of the environment as a resource for tourists and scientists. In rich biological regions, humans have been incorporated into natural systems for thousands of years, and their removal creates a disruption of the local ecosystem. In addition to being ineffective in its own goals, fortress conservation's insistence on the displacement of humans from nature has resulted in injustices against some of the most marginalized populations on Earth.
The case of Manú National Park is just one example of the failure of traditional conservation practices to address social justice components. Recently, there has been a shift in attitudes and policy decisions regarding conservation towards an emphasis on democracy, environmental justice, and local involvement in development. This view of people in parks encourages community-based conservation, which is founded in the idea that local people have important knowledge of resources as a result of their dependence upon them, and therefore their involvement in resource management would support livelihoods, conservation, and contribute towards the actualization of procedural justice.
However, this philosophical shift towards community-based conservation has largely been impeded. The general reluctance to accept these new types of management strategies is a result of the continuation of the ideal of fortress conservation and the theories and structures that support it. Therefore, in order to carry out this shift, it will be important to maintain a focus on social justice and the preservation of cultural as well as biological diversity in the management of national parks and protected areas.
Name na teri, ti machiri kiringa, kashire hei.